Ardenweald, home of gorgeous views, cute animals, playful NPCs, and undoubtedly, furries. This home of iconic swirly trees that will likely follow the path of Teldrassil by the end of the expansion houses the Night Fae, the last of our 4 covenants. Follow my Twitch, you animals! I've recently hit Senior Yiffer status in the Furry Union Club Kingdom, and this zone is not only a perfect match for me and other such weirdos that appreciate the myriad of furry forest-dwelling creatures, but also I managed to check out the new Covenant class abilities in action. Like the previous zones, a minimal bit of questing will net you your Night Fae class ability, and now that we have our final ability available for testing, it's time for the next installment of our series, Covenant Life in the Dumpster, a rogue versus priest love story. As before, let's first take a look at the general Covenant ability that all proud Night Fae members will receive. Soul Shape is a 90-second cooldown that not only gives you a 30% sprint while active, but gives you the ability to teleport 10 yards forward every 5 seconds, which allows you to get multiple uses per Soul Shape cast. This ability also has the small added benefit of lasting indefinitely in rested areas, which lets you get around a bit faster if mounting's not an option. Perhaps most important is that this ability allows you to turn into a very colorful and cool looking fox with great spell effects. Sorry to the lowly Volpera players, but this is what real fox peak performance looks like. It's time to look at the class abilities now, and I'm going to give out an NSFW warning, as most of these spells are quite orgasmic to look at. Another Covenant, another round of happy Death Knights. I'm shocked and or appalled. Death's Due replaces Death and Decay and deals a light amount of shadow damage over 10 seconds, while still maintaining all of D&D's benefits such as increased target amount for Heart Strike Cleave. The new benefit is that every 1 second tick of Death's Due decreases your target's damage done to you by 1% and increases your strength by 1%, both stacking up to 15% for 15 seconds. Each tick refreshes the timer so that at the end of the 10-second effect, your target has 10% damage reduction against you and you have 10% strength for 15 seconds. The strength effect stacks per target hit, so if you have 3 enemies inside of the Death's Due, you'll have 15% strength in 5 seconds, and this value will keep refreshing to 15 seconds every tick. For Frost and Unholy, you're running around with a nice bit of strength, likely often at cap in any AoE or cleave situation for 25 out of 30 seconds since D&D has a 30-second cooldown. That's 83.3, repeating of course, percent uptime. The story gets even better for Blood due to their reduced D&D cooldown of 15 seconds. You're essentially able to maintain the buff and enemy debuff 100% of the time, assuming no target swap for the debuff of course. This gives us a scarily real chance that there are going to be cuddly Night Fae Death Knights, which is kind of like finding out your favorite death metal band are all vegans and drive Priuses. Ancient Aftershock for Warriors is a monster of an ability. It has a fairly solid cooldown of 90 seconds, which smashes up to 5 enemies around the warrior for moderate damage, stunning them for 1.5 seconds. This also leaves a heavy dot debuff that ticks every 2 seconds and produces 6 rage per tick. The combined damage is quite significant, and you also get 36 rage per target after the dot fully ticks, which equals 180 rage if you effect a full 5 targets. The only downside, of course, is the 5 target cap, but at this point, I'm sure most warriors are used to AoE caps, especially Fury. Warriors honestly have the best type of problem for Covenants, as they're all quite good and it's going to be hard to pick. It's like waking up and wondering, do we take the Lambo or the Ferrari to work today? Meanwhile, Shadow Priests are out here picking between a push bike with 1 wheel or using Devouring Plague. After being let down with the Necrolord and Venthyr abilities, I didn't know if I could ever love Paladin Covenant abilities again. But then Blessing of Seasons came along. This is a very fun ability which harbors a lot of control and provides some major utility, which I'm always a fan of. This ability provides 4 sequential 1-minute buffs to nearby party members rotating in set order. The order is Spring, which increases healing done and received by 10%, Summer, which causes attacks to have a high chance to deal extra holy damage, Autumn, which gives 15% cooldown reduction, and of course Winter, which causes party members' attacks to reduce enemy movement speed by 20% and attack speed by 10%. After that, it recycles. You control the Blessing trigger by pressing the Blessing of Seasons button, which starts the 1-minute buff of the next season and puts the ability on a 15-second cooldown. This means that you can either choose to spend the entire 60 seconds in that season's buff, or quickly rotate to the next season if you're planning for a future rotation, or need a particular buff during a specific moment. Now, there do exist limitations because, of course, there do. Blessings are only party-wide, not raid-wide, and you cannot have more than 1 blessing active per party. So for example, if one paladin uses Winter, but 5 seconds later another paladin uses Summer, it will overwrite Winter to Summer, and that will be the active party blessing for 1 minute. This seems a bit restrictive and counterintuitive for the whole bring the player and choose whatever covenant you want thing, so hopefully they change it, at least by the end of the expansion. Overall, a really good ability for paladins, and it'll be a large contender against Kyrian. Not to be mistaken as a popular urban dance, Feline Stomp is the name of the Night Fae ability for monks. First off, this ability looks amazing and it performs about as well as it looks. Feline Stomp is, finally, a low 30-second cooldown that smashes a random tree-like image on the ground in front of the monk, damaging enemies for light damage and applying a secondary effect based on spec. So for Brewmasters, you apply Breath of Fire to all targets hit, regardless if they're debuffed with Keg Smash. For Windwalkers, you spawn Chi and Energy Spheres, and for Mistweavers, you heal allies with an Essence Font Bolt. To make this ability even better, if you fight on top of the Feline, your abilities have a 10% chance to reset Feline Stomp's cooldown, and seemingly it has no ICD. This mixes well with the already quick baseline GCD of Monk, so you can get some successive stomps off in a row with a bit of luck, covering the entire area in a thick blue forest. The only small complaint, which I'm obligated to find as a WoW player because I'm never happy, resides in the restriction of needing to stand within the Feline to try to reset its cooldown. So if there's any mobility involved, you won't have that chance, but the cooldown is so low that it really won't matter much. This ability is a winner. Wild Spirits for Hunters is a fairly solid AoE-based Covenant ability. With a 2-minute cooldown, you can blanket a large area applying Wild Mark to all enemies within, making them take 5% increased damage from you. Furthermore, any ability you cast on targets within the area causes a Wild Spirit to come out and hit an extra time for some light to moderate damage. This can add up a fair bit depending on your attack speed since it doesn't seem to have a cap. Overall, not a bad Covenant ability unless the mobs are constantly on the move because your tank moves them out of your area, which of course I will. Just what we needed. More pets and summons doing Hunter's jobs for them. But to be fair, if I had to pick between the reliability of pet AI and a Hunter main, I'd pick the pet. Soul Rot isn't just what you suffer after grinding Conflict and Strife in BFA, but it also happens to be the name of the Night Fae Covenant ability for Warlocks. Unfortunately, some you win and some you lose. While not the worst class ability we've seen across these Covenants, this one isn't certainly spectacular either, which is quite worrying considering Warlocks are supposed to always have overpowered things. Soul Rot is a 60-second cooldown that applies a light to medium 8-second dot cleaving from your main target on up to 3 more enemies. During this debuff, your drained soul will drain from any target with Soul Rot on them, and also not consume any mana. This seems to have a slight benefit currently for Affliction, as it likely does count as another dot effect on the target for the purposes of Malefic Rapture damage. Unfortunately, Drained Soul currently did not seem to work with it. To make matters slightly worse, you nuke yourself for 20% of max HP when using the ability, presumably because you can easily heal it back with Drained Soul Cleave unless you don't need or want the light damage. So you'll need to be careful not to give yourself at low HP, as tempting as that may sound with 6-second pet summons on the horizon. Demon Hunters have an interesting ability for Night Fae called the it's called what? Okay, that makes more sense. Demon Hunters have an interesting ability for Night Fae called the Hunt. This ability has a fairly lengthy cooldown of 3 minutes where you can dash at your target within 50, yes 50, yards, inflicting a moderate to high amount of nature damage and rooting them in place for 3 seconds. Furthermore, you debuff the target for 1 minute, causing all shears or demons' bites against them to generate 50% more fury, so you can spam your overly complicated rotation even harder. Also, since Demon Hunters vastly lack mobility, you can re-enable the hunt every 30 seconds during the debuff to teleport behind the marked target, even through line of sight. This ability can provide some solid single target burst, especially as it will scale with haste since more spam means more resources during the 50% bonus, but of course, severely lacks AoE. The added mobility and line of sight ignore will make Demon Hunters even more annoying to shake off in PvP. Now all they really need is a Mortal Strike effect added to their arsenal. Oh wait. Fae Blessings is a fairly diverse and fun Covenant ability for wait, what does that say? Priests? Well, it seems hell has frozen over and given a 90-second cooldown that gives you 10 sprites or charges, essentially causing your next 10 spells to have support effects depending on which spell you use based on your spec. The 3 shared categories of utility across the specs include reducing an ally's damage taken by 10% for 15 seconds, giving your target 2% mana or 20% resource, and finally, reducing the cooldown of an entire party's major abilities by 3 seconds. This essentially turns priests into batteries of utility and resource, which is always fun in my opinion, but also provides open-ended gameplay and more choice. The flip side, of course, is that there's no direct throughput of healing or damage in this ability, but rather has ways to improve those through other means, like resource gain. To make matters slightly worse, recently Mind Blast was removed as a utility-granting spell from the list for Shadow and Discipline. Don't get too excited, Shadow, this is as good as it's going to get for you for a long time. Following the trend of great-looking Night Fae spell effects, Shifting Power for mages is a modest 45-second cooldown that channels for about 6 seconds and pulses 4 times. This hits all enemies within 15 yards for moderate damage while also reducing your cooldowns by 3 seconds every pulse for a total of 12 seconds reduction. This cooldown reduction, however, does not affect Shifting Power itself. The proximity restriction is for the damage portion only, but it's still a bit of a nuisance to have to get into melee, especially with a low 45-second cooldown like this. This mage ability is definitely one of the better ones we've seen so far and will be a welcome addition to Arcane's small GCD usage list. Chain Harvest is the oh wait, that's the Venthyr ability. I'm sorry, I was mistaken since most of the Covenant abilities we've seen so far for Shaman are nearly identical in base design. Fate Transfusion is a 2-minute cooldown and follows the same base principle as Kyrian and Venthyr. You do some damage with a target cap, and then you do some healing with a target cap. Specifically, you channel for 3 seconds worth of moderate damage on up to 4 enemies in a target area, after which you can re-enable the button within 20 seconds, and splash 25% of that damage done as healing for up to 4 allies near you. The spell used to be an 8-target cap with half the efficacy, but shame on you for wanting to hit more things at once. Although the ability looks great aesthetically and has some decent utility, it lacks creativity. Furthermore, needing to be in melee range potentially as Elemental or Resto just to splash the healing can be tedious, and 25% of the overall damage is a bit underwhelming considering that it has a 2-minute cooldown. It seems the devs have run out of good Covenant ability ideas for Shamans, which is fine because I've also run out of good things to say about Shamans after 4 Covenant previews. The design is tired, repetitive, and inspires little excitement, just like M+ affixes. Although Night Fae is a perfect thematic match for Druids, nothing's ever really perfect for Feral. Convoke the Spirits for Druids is a 2-pump chump spell that has a 2-minute cooldown with a 4-second duration, lasting about as long as I did in university. During these 4 seconds, you spam a combination of 16 different spells ranging from Moonfire to Rejuvenation to Thrash on all nearby targets. Spells for your spec are favored, but you don't have any control on which spells hit what target. For instance, in a Guardian channel, I noticed some Rejuves, Regrowths, a bunch of Iron Furs, Moonfires, Rakes, a couple of Thrashes, and only one Mangle. The lack of control is definitely a turn-off for the spell in my opinion. The ability is a mediocre offensive and defensive burst at best, and is further limited by range, which makes it a bit annoying as Boomkin and Resto to have to get into the midst of melee just to make sure every ability lands. Finally, there's nothing really new or exciting about this ability. It's about as bland as a classic player's DPS rotation. Sepsis for Rogues is a decent at best Covenant ability, and definitely better than some of the previous ones that we've seen like Kyrian and Venthyr, but this wasn't exactly a difficult task to accomplish. This 90-second cooldown puts a moderate dot on the target for 10 seconds. If the target dies with the effect on them, then 60 seconds of the cooldown are refunded. However, if the target survives, they are hit for a heavy amount of damage and the rogue vanishes for free. This essentially gives you a second delayed vanish on a 90-second cooldown and can have some nice benefits, especially for subtlety. This ability is not without its limitations, however. First off, just like the previous Covenant abilities, there is no AoE component to this at all, just single target. Also, this ability is an absolute nightmare when in solo content because if the target doesn't die within 10 seconds, you vanish and reset the mob. Sometimes you can prevent the reset by quickly spamming the mob, but oftentimes it causes an evade and reset, rendering the ability largely useless in mid to high tier solo play, aside for a small execute in the last few seconds of mob health. Looks like priests win this episode of our series. Sorry, rogues. It's been a long journey, but we finally reached the end of our Covenant previews for all 4 Covenants. Although the Night Fae houses some of the most gorgeous aesthetics we've seen to date, you'll still have to make a tough, meaningful decision since there won't be an easy way to turn back to a Covenant after you've left. This will only be made tougher when inevitably there's another Covenant released midway through the expansion that is better than yours and undermines all the hard work and time investment you've put into your current one. There's lots of things to consider when making your choice, whether it be Kyrians with Soulkin memes, Necrolord's Fleshcraft for high damage absorb, the beauty and utility of the Night Fae, or the Venthyr, which have a short portal cooldown to anywhere within 35 yards, have one of the coolest looking zones and themes, how some of the best Covenant abilities have been recently data mined to have brokenly good soulbinds, including a cheat death amongst a ton of Now that you've chosen the Venthyr as your Covenant, it's time to give thought at the life that could have been if you had landed in one of the other 3 Covenants. A life where no one will invite you to groups unless you follow the perceived meta. The freedom of choice. Well, that does it for me. If you have any other questions or just want to hang out, feel free to stop by my Twitch channel where I spend most of my time pretending that I have friends. Also, make sure you hit that follow and subscribe button to stay up to date with the massive content coming in from Alpha and hopefully soon enough Beta.